It happened fast. Charlie Kirk, conservative leader, outspoken defender of faith and freedom, was gunned down outside a Turning Point USA event in Arizona. The man behind the trigger, 23-year-old Tyler Robinson of Washington County, Utah. Police say Robinson had been carrying engraved rounds, carved with bitter jokes aimed at Kirk's beliefs. Within hours, the nation was reeling. A bold voice for America's heartland silenced, not by random violence, but by an act driven by ideology. But who was Tyler Robinson? On the surface, he seemed like any young man from the Red Rock country of southern Utah, an apprentice electrician, quiet, hardworking, raised in a devout Mormon household where Sunday service was routine and family dinners ended in prayer. His neighbors described him as reserved, polite, even shy. Yet beneath that calm exterior, something darker was brewing. The Robinson family lived in the kind of community most Americans would recognize as solid, traditional, and deeply rooted. Washington County, tucked against the desert cliffs, is overwhelmingly conservative. Kirk himself once praised the strength of the Latter-day Saints in Utah for their family values and civic spirit. Strangely enough, that praise marked a turning point in Robinson's life. Because shortly after Kirk's words, Tyler did something shocking. He renounced his faith. He cut ties with the church that had defined his identity, brushing off the religion of his parents as chains. From there, the spiral began. His online posts grew sharper, filled with language echoing Antifa manifestos, raging against capitalism, railing against anyone who carried a Bible to the public square. How does a young man raised on scripture and small-town decency turn into someone who plots an ideological assassination? To answer that, we need to dig into his upbringing and the fractures that quietly tore through his once steady foundation. Tyler Robinson grew up in what most would call the American ideal. His father, a contractor with calloused hands, taught him discipline through hard work. His mother ran the home with steady warmth, guiding her children with faith and structure. Church wasn't optional. It was the heartbeat of the Robinson household. From scout meetings to Sunday sermons, Tyler was expected to walk the straight path. In Washington County, neighbors know each other by name. Families gather at high school football games, and small businesses anchor the town square. Politics leaned heavily conservative, pro-family, pro-faith, pro-America. It was the kind of environment where a boy like Tyler should have thrived, and for a while, he did. Friends remember him in his early teens as mild-mannered Baptist, always with a Bible tucked under his arm, volunteering at youth groups, even singing hymns alongside his siblings. But around 16, cracks appeared. Tyler grew quieter, moodier. Teachers noticed he would turn in assignments that had little jabs at authority, mocking free market economics in his essays, questioning the very faith that had raised him. Still, no one flagged it as more than teenage rebellion. His father tried to guide him back, reminding him of his heritage, his responsibility. Yet Tyler resisted, and the rift between father and son widened. What puzzled many was how abrupt the change was. He didn't drift slowly away from religion. He tore himself from it like it was a burden, and it coincided chillingly with Charlie Kirk's public praise for the strength of Mormon values. To Tyler, it wasn't encouragement, it was an insult. He saw Kirk's words not as respect, but as a spotlight exposing everything he wanted to reject. That moment hardened him. What began as teenage skepticism grew into outright hostility, and instead of leaning on his family, he turned to the internet, a darker classroom where radical ideas were waiting. The question is, what exactly was he reading, and who was shaping his thoughts in those quiet late-night hours? Late nights in his small basement room became Tyler Robinson's new sanctuary. While his family prayed upstairs, Tyler scrolled, his feeds filled with anger, not the kind that flares and fades, but organized, doctrinaire, radical. Antifa-style manifestos, posts dripping with contempt for traditionalist parasites, threads celebrating the downfall of faith-based institutions. He wasn't just browsing, he was absorbing, mimicking the rhetoric like scripture rewritten reverse. Online, Tyler found what he didn't get at home: affirmation. On anonymous boards, his disdain for conservatives was praised. His jabs at capitalism were cheered. The language he once mocked as church speak was replaced with chants about tearing down systems, smashing hierarchies, dismantling fascist influence. For Tyler, this wasn't politics. It was personal. The faith of his childhood and the conservatism of his hometown became his target, and in that target, Charlie Kirk loomed large. Kirk wasn't just a political figure to Tyler. He represented everything Tyler had walked away from: unapologetic belief, the defense of family, the public embrace of Christian values. To the online echo chambers, Kirk was a propagandist of the right. To Tyler, he became something darker, a fixation. Yet in public, Tyler played the opposite role. As an apprentice electrician, he was quiet, disciplined, blending into job sites with his hard hat and tool belt. Co-workers said he kept to himself, never raised his voice, never betrayed a hint of rage. But on his phone, away from watchful eyes, his bitterness boiled. He kept digital notebooks where he twisted scripture into mockery, drafted rants against conservative speakers, and laughed at what he called the blind sheep of the heartland. His family sensed something was wrong. His mother described him as absent even when present. His father grew frustrated with his dismissive tone. But they didn't yet see the full picture, the parallel life their son had built in radical corners of the internet. The danger became clear only when Tyler began moving from words to preparation, and the signs of that shift were as chilling as they were deliberate. The shift from rhetoric to planning didn't happen overnight, but once it began, it was unmistakable. Tyler Robinson grew obsessed with details. He started stockpiling notes, notebooks filled with sketches, lists, and cryptic phrases that blended humor with menace. Investigators would later find pages of ammunition designs, each round marked with engravings. Some bore mocking in-jokes, the kind only his online circles would understand. Others were twisted parodies of scripture, carved into brass as if mocking his own upbringing. He took pride in the precision. As an electrical apprentice, Tyler was trained to measure twice, cut once. He applied that same meticulous mindset to his dark project. He tracked Charlie Kirk's speaking schedule, noting venues, times, and security patterns. He studied live streams of Turning Point USA events, observing how Kirk greeted supporters, where he stood, how long he lingered at doors. Every movement became data in Tyler's grim calculations. What startled investigators most wasn't the raw hatred, it was the cold humor threaded through it. He seemed to treat the act not only as revenge against Kirk, but as a twisted performance for an unseen audience online. His digital messages were littered with sarcasm, as though he believed he was playing a role in some grotesque satire of faith and conservatism. To the people around him, none of this showed. Tyler was still the quiet worker, still the son who sat silently at the dinner table. But inside, he was rehearsing lines, imagining headlines, preparing himself not just to strike, but to send a message. His parents only caught fragments: a sudden disinterest in family prayers, a sarcastic comment about God, a laugh at the mention of Kirk's name. To them, it was troubling, but not alarming. They didn't know that their son was already testing weapons, already engraving bullets, already plotting with the precision of a craftsman turned radical. The mask held until the night Tyler's obsession crossed into action, and that's when the fractures inside his own family began to break wide open. Inside the Robinson household, tension had become routine. Tyler's father, a man of discipline and faith, noticed his son slipping further into cynicism. Dinner conversations grew shorter. Tyler no longer bowed his head at grace. Instead, he smirked, sometimes muttering sharp comments about worshiping fairy tales. His younger siblings avoided him, sensing the bitterness he carried. What his parents didn't know was that Tyler had created a hidden online identity. Through encrypted forums, he vented his rage and shared mock jokes about targeting conservative leaders. To outsiders, the jokes might seem like dark banter, but in context, they were chilling. Half confession, half blueprint. He described ammunition engravings as if they were art projects, playing to an invisible crowd that cheered his defiance. Still, he blended into daily life. He rose early for job sites, wiring houses and troubleshooting circuits. Co-workers said he was reliable, never late, never loud. He earned a steady paycheck, handed part of it to his mother for household expenses. On the surface, he was a dutiful son, but privately his world had narrowed to a single fixation: dismantling the conservative voices he blamed for his inner torment. The breaking point came in small moments. One evening, when his father mentioned Kirk's speech praising the Mormon faith, Tyler snapped. He slammed his fork down, declaring, "That man doesn't speak for me." The outburst stunned the family. His father pressed him, but Tyler retreated to his room, door slammed shut. That door became a barrier not just of wood, but of ideology. His father began to suspect something deeper. He noticed tools missing, unexplained purchases on the family bank account. When he confronted Tyler, the young man grew evasive, angry, dismissive. A father's instinct told him the truth. His son was preparing for something dangerous, and that instinct would soon put him in an unthinkable position, forced to choose between protecting his child or protecting his country. The choice no parent ever wants to face came crashing down on Tyler Robinson's father. He stumbled upon what investigators would later call the key discovery, a small case tucked beneath Tyler's bed. Inside were rounds of ammunition, each one engraved with crude, mocking inscriptions aimed at Charlie Kirk. They weren't random etchings. They were intentional, deliberate, almost ceremonial. His father's hands shook as he realized what he was holding. The weight of the brass felt heavier than metal. It was the weight of betrayal. He confronted Tyler that night, his voice firm but breaking. Tyler's response was chillingly calm. He didn't deny the engravings. Instead, he smirked and said, "Someone has to shut him up." For a man rooted in faith and order, hearing those words from his own son was devastating. Tyler's father tried to reason with him, reminding him of scripture, of family honor, of the sanctity of life. But Tyler dismissed it all, sneering at the values that had shaped his childhood. The gulf between father and son was no longer generational. It was ideological, unbridgeable. What followed was a sleepless night. His father wrestled with questions no parent should bear. Do I protect my son and risk blood on my conscience? Or do I act, knowing it may destroy my family? At dawn, his decision was made. He picked up the phone and called authorities. He turned his own son in. That single call set off a chain reaction. Federal agents moved quickly, tracking Tyler's movements, monitoring his communications. What they uncovered confirmed the father's worst fears. Tyler wasn't fantasizing. He had mapped out his plan with precision, down to the location, the timing, and the mocking spectacle of those engraved bullets. The betrayal of faith, family, and community was now complete, and as agents closed in, the nation braced to learn how a quiet Mormon boy had become an emblem of leftist radical rage. When agents began piecing together Tyler Robinson's digital footprint, the portrait grew darker. His online profiles weren't just dabbling in dissent, they were steeped in radicalism. Posts lifted straight from Antifa talking points, memes mocking Christians as useful fools, threads where he called conservative leaders domestic threats. He wasn't arguing policy, he was declaring war on an entire worldview. Investigators found message chains where Tyler bragged about his engraved rounds. He described them like inside jokes, tiny trophies that only his online comrades would understand. To them, it was entertainment. To Tyler, it was fuel, confirmation that his path was righteous in their twisted eyes. He wrote about mocking the flock and making faith bleed ink instead of truth. The language was theatrical, but the intent was crystal clear. Neighbors back in Washington County were stunned when the news broke. They remembered a boy who once mowed lawns to earn pocket money, who showed up for scout service projects, who sang in the church choir. How could that same boy be the one scribbling manifestos at midnight? The answer, investigators suggested, lay in the isolation of radical echo chambers. Tyler didn't just lose faith, he replaced it with a new religion of rage. His rejection of Mormonism wasn't quiet. He mocked temple rituals online, twisting sacred practices into punchlines. He claimed Kirk's praise for the church was proof that faith had sold out to politics. For Tyler, that overlap of religion and conservatism wasn't inspiration, it was betrayal. He aimed to punish the very people who embodied it. The paradox was glaring. Raised in a community that championed order, he embraced chaos. Trained as an electrician to wire homes with precision, he used that discipline to wire his hatred into a weapon. The stage was set, and on the day of Kirk's event, Tyler Robinson put his months of planning into motion, walking calmly into history's darkest kind of spotlight. September sunlight cut across the plaza as crowds gathered for Charlie Kirk's Turning Point USA event. To supporters, it was another chance to hear a bold voice defend faith, family, and freedom. But to Tyler Robinson, it was the culmination of months of obsession. He had tracked Kirk's schedule, memorized entry points, studied where security tightened and where it thinned. Every detail was part of a grim rehearsal. Witnesses later recalled seeing him move with eerie calm. Dressed plainly, he blended into the crowd. No shouts, no outbursts, just silence. That silence masked the storm inside him. In his pocket were the engraved rounds, each one mocking the man he'd chosen as his target. Investigators would note the bizarre mix of humor and hat etched into them, proof that this wasn't just violence, it was theater meant to ridicule. For Tyler, this was his performance. He saw himself not as a lone attacker, but as a messenger for an ideology that thrived on destruction. The fact that his victim was Charlie Kirk, an outspoken Christian, a defender of conservative youth, was no coincidence. To Tyler, striking Kirk meant striking the faith and values he had spent years trying to erase from his own life. The attack unfolded in seconds. Panic swept through the plaza. Supporters dove for cover, security scrambled. But Tyler didn't run. That was never his plan. His calm demeanor at the scene, according to officials, reflected a man who believed he had achieved his purpose. What he hadn't planned for was the aftermath. Within hours, authorities pieced together the evidence. His notebooks, his online posts, the engravings on his ammunition. And as his name hit the headlines, the story shifted from shock to dissection. How could a boy from Utah's conservative heartland end up carrying the banner of leftist rage? The answer, in part, was written in the contradictions of his own personality, contradictions his family had wrestled with for years. The contradictions defined Tyler Robinson. To co-workers, he was steady, an electrician's apprentice who showed up on time, kept his head down, and worked with precision. He rarely joked, rarely lost his temper. Some even described him as a kid you could trust with dangerous tools. Yet that same composure made his double life even harder to detect. At home, the divide grew sharper. His mother clung to the hope that faith could pull him back. She invited him to join family prayer circles, to attend Sunday services, to sit with his siblings at church. Tyler refused, sometimes with silence, sometimes with biting sarcasm. His rejection wasn't casual, it was deliberate. Every gesture of devotion from his family felt to him like a reminder of what he despised. What gnawed at him most was Kirk's public embrace of Mormon values. For millions, it was affirmation. For Tyler, it was gasoline on a fire. He told friends online that Kirk's praise was a mask for control, a marriage of politics and religion that poisons freedom. In his twisted worldview, Kirk symbolized the very merger he wanted to destroy. Even his quirks betrayed his radicalization. He began refusing family meals when grace was said. He scrawled slogans in the margins of his work manuals, snippets of anarchist rhetoric mixed with mockery of scripture. And in private forums, he reveled in the applause of strangers who shared his rage. Yet to the people in Washington County who had known him since childhood, the transformation seemed impossible. This was the boy who once volunteered at food drives, who carried hymnals in church, who promised to take over his father's trade. They saw a quiet young man. What they missed was the fury simmering just beneath. That fury, fed by ideology and sharpened by isolation, ultimately collided with reality. And when the smoke cleared, the consequences weren't just about one man's crime. They became a warning shot to the entire nation. The warning was undeniable. Tyler Robinson's act wasn't random. It was ideological. It was the story of a boy raised in faith and family who chose to trade it for rage and rebellion. And it's the story of how unchecked radicalism, amplified by online echo chambers, can twist ordinary lives into dangerous weapons. Charlie Kirk stood as a symbol of strength, championing conservative youth, defending faith in the public square, and refusing to bow to cultural intimidation. That made him a target for Robinson, who saw in Kirk not just a man, but a movement he hated. When Robinson pulled the trigger, he wasn't just lashing out at one individual. He was striking at the values of millions of Americans who still believe in God, family, and freedom. Yet, even in tragedy, the Robinson family offered a stark example of courage. His father, torn between loyalty to his son and loyalty to truth, chose the latter. He picked up the phone and turned Tyler in, preventing what could have been even greater devastation. It was an act of painful patriotism, a reminder that duty sometimes means sacrifice inside your own home. As investigators sifted through Robinson's writings, the pattern was clear: rejection of faith, embrace of far-left extremism, and a chilling obsession with humiliating conservative voices. His story became a case study in what happens when America's youth are lured away from tradition and swallowed by radical ideologies. The lesson is not subtle. If it can happen in Washington County, Utah, an enclave of faith and conservative strength, it can happen anywhere. Robinson's path is proof that the fight for America's values isn't abstract. It's personal. It's in our homes, our schools, our churches. And so the final chapter of this story isn't about Tyler Robinson. It's about us, about whether we're willing to stay vigilant, to defend the principles that Charlie Kirk lived for, and to stand firm against the tide of radicalism that threatens the heartland of this country.